Hi there. Today is the 15th of May, 26, and welcome to Colin and my podcast dedicated to 50 years of modern oil trading after our book, The Rivers of Money. Today, we've got a great pleasure and a great honor to have a wonderful guest, Dave Ernsberger of S&P Global Energy. He's the president of the company. And from my point of view, I've known Dave for many, many years. And from my point of view, he epitomizes everything that's to do with benchmarks and benchmarking and prices and everything that our listeners would love to hear. So welcome, Dave.
Well, thank you, Audie, and good morning to you as well, Colin. And thank you so much for the kind words and the generous introduction. I'm enjoying the show already.
Thanks a lot. As usual, what we normally do, Colin and I would normally ask you just to say a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, happy to do it. So I am currently the president of a division of S&P Global, and the division is called S&P Global Energy. That is the combination of what many of your listeners will likely know as the Platts news and price reporting and benchmarking business, Dated Brent, Dubai, IADX, JKM, all that good stuff. Paired up with the CIRA research and advisory organization that came to us through the merger of S&P Global and IHS many years ago now, actually, about 4 or 5 years ago. And then a third piece of our division, which is called Horizons, that's our frontier work around sustainable finance, climate resilience, and those kinds of topics as well. So Energy Now, the division I'm a president of, covers all of the commodity markets all around the world, looking at news and pricing and benchmarking, research advisory, and those kinds of topics. Now, I've been with the business for 30 years, Audie, so this is my 30th anniversary, and I'm excited to be sharing it with you two fine gentlemen. I actually started in London as a price reporter covering the metals markets back in the mid-90s. And for me, having graduated fairly recently before that with a degree in philosophy and politics and a master's in international relations, you know, markets were interesting to me, but I thought they'd be a springboard to something different. They ended up being endlessly fascinating. Even today, I learn new things all the time, and I think that's one of the things that's most fun about this job. And in those 30 years, I started in London as a metals reporter, moved to Houston, where I was the bureau chief during, well, among other things, 9/11, the collapse of Enron. Left Houston, went to Asia, spent 7 really great years in Singapore, traveling around the region. Audie, that's where you and I first kind of got to know each other back in the early 2000s. And I've been back in London now for 15 years. First came back as the head of oil and then became head of pricing and news. And now, somehow, I've ended up being the president. So that's my life story.
Good stuff. Congratulations on that, and also in your 30 years, Dave.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It feels like only yesterday that a young Dave Ernsberger rocked up and started doing his job.
I know that feeling very well.
Now, Dave, let's just kind of hit the nail on the head right now. You know, how does it feel now to be in the market when we have this unprecedented event of the closure of Hormuz compared to, you know, everything we've had before? And we both, all three of us, have gone through quite a few crises.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's an interesting moment to reflect on that, Audie, because this crisis is happening as we speak all around us, and it is not very well understood, really, what the closure of the Strait of Hormuz actually means for the actual markets. And the way that feels is this event reminds me very much of the huge crises in the markets that we've seen over 3 decades. It reminds me of COVID. It reminds me of the financial crisis. It reminds me of 9/11. And it reminds me of the collapse of Enron. Those are significant market events / crises that I have lived through. I've covered markets through. I'm sure you and Colin have traded through. And the reason why I say it reminds me of those things is because in day-to-day life in the markets that we cover, there's always something going on. And the longer that there's no major crisis, the more that those small events feel like they're significant. But every now and again, you know, once every 4 or 5 years, there's something so massive, so big, that nobody can really get the measure of it because it's just so enormous. And then beyond that, it's so unprecedented that there's no playbook to refer to try and understand it. Now, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, as everybody knows by now, removed and is continuing to remove 20% of oil and gas supply from the LNG market. So 20% of oil, 20% of LNG from the global markets. And, to lose a fifth of those core energies is unprecedented, and there's no playbook to understand it. And it's so big, people are struggling to process it, which is kind of where all of us come to play a role, which is to try and genuinely, truly articulate what is happening here to help people process.
So why do you think the market is so sanguine about this? I mean, is it a case of sort of geopolitical fatigue that we've seen develop over the years from event after event that has proven not to be as bad as people feared, or is it just that people simply don't understand what's coming to them and what's happening?
Yeah, I think there are three fundamental reasons that the markets have been sanguine. Number one, and I think this is foundationally important, the energy industry in general is way more robust, resilient, flexible than it was in the 70s during the oil crises of the 70s. So, the futures markets have blossomed since then. Diversified supply has emerged since then. There are some countries where if the oil's too expensive, you flip to coal, and if the coal's too expensive, you move to solar, right? So there's flexibility in the energy system that wasn't there 30 years ago. So foundational point number one, the market's more flexible and resilient. I just think that's basically a truism that we've learned through this crisis. Number two, I think that there's a different kind of a news cycle, a different kind of a news flow that drives trading in these markets these days. So when the markets get a little heated and they get a little stressed, we'll often see statements coming out, whether it's from the U.S. administration or the EU or India does this sometimes, saying everything's fine, nothing to worry about here. We got plenty of supplies. I just saw this coming out from India overnight, actually. And somehow the market responds to high-level reassurances and takes them on good faith. So we'll see if that is actually a sustainable way of the market reacting. But certainly the market is very responsive to statements. And then the third thing, Colin, which I'll put out there, is there's a massive dislocation, actually, between what is actually happening in the physical market and what we see reported in the headlines, which focus on futures markets. This kind of spectacular divergence between the price that we will all pay at the pump for gasoline and diesel or in our homes for heating and what we see reported in headline futures prices, well, that's creating a sense of sanguinity as well, if that's a word, or making the market sanguine. Like when you look at the BBC every morning, the headline is $100, even if diesel's $300 and Dubai is $140, right? So there's something going on here where futures and physicals diverging is playing a role too.
But also, I guess part of that, and I'm probably going to throw more of an opinion rather than a question, but hoping that you may comment on that, Dave, is also that this is really different from all the crises that you've mentioned that all three of us have been through. This particular crisis is not a demand crisis and not a supply crisis either. It's basically a logistical one. So I'm now trying to put my trader's hat on. If I was a trader here, it's really hard to say, okay, there's a shortage of product here. We have a very tight situation. I'm going to go out there and buy a whole load of futures when this market could turn on a dime and Donald Trump can say tomorrow or today, look, we've won. I'm going out. In which case, suddenly you're going to have a fair bit of oil coming out into the market and things are going relatively quickly back to normal. Futures prices collapsing, probably not collapsing to 60s, but certainly to 80s, 90s. And things. So this situation is fairly different from everything we've had before.
Well, Adi, I would agree with you that it's a logistical crisis. I have a slightly different view about what's going to happen when peace is declared, by the way, which we should probably talk about because I think it's an interesting point.
Sure.
I think the closest corollary to the current crisis it was the war beginning in Ukraine. There were similarities there around supply chain stress, logistics stress. But in the end, what's different about the war in Ukraine is that really the markets needed to rewire themselves with the same fundamental availability of liquids, generally speaking, right? Whereas in this crisis, we've had 20% of the world's energy just simply cut off, which generates a different kind of logistical stress. So I agree with you on that. But here's the interesting thing for me, at least. The nature of these crises is on day one and in week one, there's an opportunity for the market to, I'm going to call it, snap back. Right. If this conflict had ended in a week around the Strait of Hormuz, then that kind of snapback dynamic you're talking about, I think, was a reasonable assumption, and certainly a lot of people talked about it. Now that we're 2.5 months in with no end in sight, now this is our research view, by the way, from the CIRA team. If peace was declared tomorrow, the U.S. naval blockade ended, the Iranians guaranteed safe passage through the strait, and it was the best possible reopening scenario for the strait, it would take 10 to 20 weeks for the sort of the inside the Gulf economic activity to even begin to get back to normal. So could futures prices fall? I think, it's reasonable to think that they would. But how long is it going to take the market to kind of fall back into normal patterns of behavior? And beyond that, Adi, what does normal mean now that the Rubicon has been crossed of closing the strait in the first place? I don't think normal will ever mean the same again.
And the deferred market prices are not reflecting that view at all.
Yeah.
Even in the future side, right? There's a sanguine element about that, about the temporal perspective of prices as well as the current perspective. And it amazes me because one of the possibilities, of course, maybe it's an outside possibility, but Trump could stand up and say, I'm going to put export bans on crude oil and refined products. Inflation in the US in certain segments is up to 6.5%. He's got midterms coming up. It's a political issue for him domestically as much as anything, and that may be his focus.
Colin, sorry. Sorry, Dave, I want to follow up with a
Luckily
question.
for me, Adi wants to comment on your comment on the U.S. administration, so I'm going to hand over to Adi.
No. I want to ask you a question on the back of this, because now that Colin's opened a Pandora's box, that's a really interesting one, which I have obviously very, very strong opinions. But what do you think, Dave, would happen if Trump did that?
Well, many people have wondered what would happen if any U.S. administration put an export ban in place. You may remember President Joe Biden flirted with similar concepts, and I'm not even sure this administration has even talked about it. But, existentially speaking for the markets, there is a real question to ask about what would happen to global energy if the U.S. put in place a ban on LNG exports / gas, right? Crude oil exports or refined product exports. And I suppose we should throw into that LPG as well, given how big the U.S. is as an LPG propane supplier. I can't comment about what the current administration will do, not least because nobody knows, right? But the U.S. is the world's biggest supplier of LNG, is the world's biggest supplier of exported crude oil barrels at this point, right, with Saudi being locked in and Russia being a little bit compromised the way it is on exports. So I think that a ban on any U.S. energy export would have to have an outsized impact on the global price of oil. I mean, Midland WTI is now deliverable against dated Brent. It's a really important part of how dated Brent works. And Midland is also delivered to refiners in India, China, Thailand, and those markets would have to pull West African barrels that just aren't there right now. They're already being consumed as part of baseload now that the Middle Eastern production is shut in. So I dare say that would spark a true crisis. And, the interesting thing about that is no country would be immune from the dramatic inflationary impact of an energy crisis. Even if there was somehow lower prices inside the U.S. borders as a result of a scenario like that, the global economic catastrophe would affect everybody, including the U.S. So, never say never, but it would be a huge impact.
And on your last point that it would affect the US as much as anyone else, one hopes, if the more extreme elements of the US administration have even thought of doing something like that, and it was in place, wasn't it, in the 70s? We researched in our book. One hopes that they would recognise that there are secondary and tertiary
Yeah.
reasons of their own not to do it.
Well, actually, Colin, it's interesting. People often forget. In fact, I didn't think about it until you just said that. But there was a U.S. executive order that did ban crude oil exports until Obama lifted it in 2016 or whatever that date was, right? 2015, something like that. So, in fact, it's not just a hypothetical. It's actually been a reality for most of our careers, right? So, but that was at a time when the U.S. was a net importer of everything and was producing about 5 million barrels a day of oil, as I recall, anyways. Now that it's producing closer to 12 million barrels a day of oil, I don't think the same drivers would be there. But you're right. The fact that it would affect everybody in the U.S. is certainly on people's minds. I'm sure every administration thinks through these kinds of options. And I guess the other thing I'd say is when the U.S. is looking to redress balance of trade, energy exports is a big part of rebalancing balance of trade. So I think there will be those who would say, why would we cut off the exports of one of the biggest contributors to trade balance, actually?
Yeah. I would even take a step further and argue that actually it's very likely that prices of gasoline, gas, petrol in the US may actually end up eventually going up if that happens, because the Brent prices would just go crazy. And then that would inevitably impact, because the balance of trade, US is actually not far off from importing some gasoline at the moment, and actually Europe is long gasoline at the moment. Yeah. So it's a kind of really interesting, but going down to rather than speculate too much.
Yeah.
I wasn't planning to do this, probably slightly unfair question, but Dave, we live in very fluid times. I mean, these are very, very difficult times where you can't sort of plan things and take a long time to do something. Imagine that were to happen. What would happen to Brent?
Well, do
you have a plan?
Yeah, well, the good thing about all of our crude benchmarks is they're designed with alternative delivery in mind, right? And actually, that if I have one sort of life journey, it's at least professionally, anyways. It's been around making sure that physical reference prices have inbuilt redundancies, failover mechanisms, alternative delivery concepts, and much, much more beyond that, which at a certain point becomes too, technical for people to really want to hear about. But, Midland is certainly a very frequently nominated grade of crude into Brent right now through the process. I'm sure you've covered that on the show. But it also has 40s, Oseberg, Ekofisk, Troll. Even a little bit of Brent Indian blend is still out there, right? So what I don't want to speculate too much on what would actually happen to the price, although, inherently, if you have less liquidity, I think the pressure is on the price to move up. I just think that's an economic kind of concept there. But at a certain point, price gets too high and it begins to move down again, right? I think we all know that too. But I can tell you that what would happen is if there was no Midland to be delivered through not through a methodology decision by Platts, but just because Midland wasn't coming out anymore, then there would be other grades that could be delivered instead. And I'll point you to Exhibit A, if I may, which is Dubai. So in Dubai, there's no Upper Zakum that can come out and be delivered against trading right now. Same with Al Shaheen. And yet there's plenty of Oman, plenty of Murban coming out of Mina Al Fahal and Fujairah. And we don't take that for granted, by the way. But that failover, that redundancy in the best possible way was built into that benchmark, just like it's built into Brent.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to say, of course, you also have in the North Sea Ernstberger, but in the past you decided not to include that for quality reasons, I guess, in the Brent basket.
Yeah, I think that's right, Colin. But if I can comment on that, Adi, I mean, when we look at alternative delivery crudes coming into a crude benchmark, we have to think really hard about, the industry does, about what does every new crude that's deliverable do to the inherent value of the group of crudes that represent the benchmark. And, we've heard a lot of support for the idea that there should be, especially in the North Sea, with Urals being out of the market right now for most people, a medium sour reference, a heavier reference, and a lighter, sweeter reference. So, you're right. We didn't bring in Ernsberger because of it was so genetically different from the rest of the basket. But we're always keeping an eye on those things, and we can come back to those questions in the future if we needed to.
But your decision to go with Midland has proven to be the correct one, right? It's been a huge success for you. You must be very proud and pleased of that.
Well, actually, it was. Well, thank you, Colin. I mean, look, a lot of people were involved in that consultation. It was a very, very tricky decision. We made it during the pandemic, and people were locked down. We were all meeting on Teams, and all that didn't help with the process. But I think we got to the right outcome in the end, and the proof of that is that people don't ask me about it anymore. It's just part of how the market works, and I think that's a good thing.
Well, what I was aiming at a little bit is you generally tend to make most of your decisions as a consensus with the rest of the markets. First, you meet up with markets, you suggest an idea, you listen to what everyone says, and then you make appropriate changes. And I was just wondering whether that process might be a little bit difficult now, a little bit more difficult, because like, going back to Dubai, for example, I mean, Dubai is now so big. It's massive. It's probably as big, if not bigger than Brent. I haven't looked in the last few months. It's just huge. The deliveries in the window are absolutely massive, and you have a very large number of people. So the sheer volumes. So when you lost 2 grades in the Dubai, the market did nudge up a little bit. Obviously, we won't go into various reasons why. I mean, there are good reasons, because the Hormuz was blocked. But I'm wondering whether one of my ideas, I think we had a chat at the time, and one of the ideas was like, well, I would probably try and introduce some other grade just to beef up that volume of liquidity, because it's such a big benchmark that you really, and you have players who are very, very big as well. So you can nudge up that volume of liquidity. Do you have that possibility to make some quick decisions, or do you think it's just too difficult because of consensus?
Well, yeah. Thanks, Adi. This is a very timely question. So, on changing benchmark methodology, the way that I think about that is it is a massively consultative process. It's based on consultation. I don't know that decisions are necessarily based on a consensus outcome. And the reason why I say that is because it's almost impossible to arrive at anything that resembles consensus on some of these very specific questions. But it is completely possible to have as a very wide aperture on your consultation. So I am really committed, and I know everybody who runs Platts now is really committed to the idea that if there's anything to be done to evolve a benchmark, it has to be subject to the widest possible consultation to get all the perspectives, all the opinions. We have one going on right now, Adi, about what is the definition of open in the Strait of Hormuz. That is a consultation. But I can tell you there is absolutely no consensus emerging at this point about what open really means. And that's a great example, because at some point, Platts is going to have to give a view about whether the strait is open or not. And that's not a military question. It's not a political question. I mean, it is for other people. But for us, it's a benchmark question. What does it mean for a benchmark? What does it mean for the strait to be open? So, and then I kind of want to come to your question about alternative deliveries against Dubai, or even Brent for that matter. I think that the curation of these benchmarks involves regular reassessment of what grades ought to be included in a delivery mechanism. And we've been asked that question. I was in India 3 weeks ago, and I can tell you that in India, where they feel the pain of these shortfalls more than almost any other importing nation in the world, there's a very animated discussion about bringing alternative delivery grades into Dubai, and even Brent for that matter. But, what I was saying in India, and what I'll say here, and I'll say to anybody who asks me is, we take custodianship of benchmarks incredibly seriously. And I'm sure every benchmark provider does, whether it's a PRA, a price reporting agency, or a futures exchange, or anybody else. If there's an opportunity to consult on something, we will absolutely take it, which means by definition, we won't make a quick decision on bringing something in. It's always easier to take something out of a benchmark than to put something in. That's basically a truism.
Yeah, and you guys have never really in the past been afraid of a little bit of muscularity about your innovation, and I guess you need to be definitive. You need to be decision makers, and like traders do in their day-to-day job, to execute and make choices.
Yeah, that's right, Colin. I mean, I guess the way I think of that is we have to be prepared to make decisions about our benchmarks. And we're subject to market forces just like traders are. If we make bad decisions, the market will punish us. If we make good decisions, the market will reward us. But in the end, and I hear this a lot from people, they want to see a consultation, they want to see a clear process, they also want to see a decision.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, Dave, that's great, because what I do, I want to use, obviously, I would love to talk to you about Brent and Dubai into a lot of details, but I'm not going to, because I think having your seniority here, I think we could do a lot better than that. I was just wondering, you've got a lot more things to look after, and generally, do you, through your experience and knowledge, do you have some sort of bigger formula of how benchmarks should work and how generally they should operate? And let me just explain where I'm aiming at, is that benchmarks are essentially, and you know this story of mine through our private conversation, benchmarks are private, basically public goods. Everyone benefits from knowing where dated Brent is, where Dubai is, okay? But essentially it's privately provided and generally works very well. But you have, you call custodianship, I call it governorship, and it works together with price makers, price takers, and then brokers and everybody else. So there's a huge ecosystem of people that you have to bring in. As you were saying, you're talking to people. But it's a very complicated process. Do you have some sort of general way of doing it for all the other benchmarks and how you see them work? I know it's a tough question.
No, it's a great question, and I love it because this is something, I'm kind of like an elder statesman now in my world. I walk around the office here and everybody looks at me like I'm some kind of old man, and I think that my contribution now amongst, I have certain responsibilities as the president of the division, and I have other responsibilities kind of culturally and philosophically. And I think a big responsibility I have is to help the next generation of benchmark providers understand the answer to that question. So I guess I would approach the answer in two ways. Firstly, I am very interested in which markets in 2026 need benchmarks that don't have them today. Right, I am super interested in how we maintain the ones that exist. Those are very important. We spent a lot of time talking about them today. But then I'm very interested in, critical minerals, battery metals, renewable power, electricity. There's a whole issue around data centers in the U.S. leading to a spike in U.S. electricity demand, which is the raising need for kind of new and different benchmarks in U.S. electricity, just as an example, right? There's a huge discussion about water markets that has been going on actually my entire career. Has the time arrived for water to have a benchmark? These are the things that I'm always thinking about, right? We looked at carbon markets about 5 or 6 years ago. We had that conversation then. So the first part of my answer would be, it's kind of it's a responsibility for all of us to be looking at which commodity markets and which physical markets need benchmarks that don't have them today. And then when you find those markets, Adi, and to really zero in on your question, as a provider of benchmarks, the value that we can create begins in identifying, well, what could be, therefore, the benchmark that helps people to understand the public good question you just talked about, right? And the role of a benchmark, without getting too introspective with you, but the role of a benchmark is to represent the value of something so that everything else in the world that is related to it can trade efficiently. Like, it has to be representative, but not all inclusive. It has to be specific, but it has to be generally applicable. And there are ways to get to that answer that are kind of part of the secret sauce that I try and hand out to other people here. But there are basic principle-based questions we have to get to for benchmarks to do a job. But before I'm done here, I hope we launch at least 2 or 3 more big benchmarks, because they're there to be done.
It's interesting. One of the things that I find a little strange in a way is, given that we're dealing with a marketplace, and we've referred to this many times in our booklet, is one of the largest, least well understood, most remunerative, most important markets for just about everything going on in the world. The regulatory impact or oversight or concern about our markets relative to their concern about other financial product markets seems to have been surprisingly limited to me. do you find yourselves very actively engaged with regulators or not so much?
Well, I don't know if you know, Colin, but our benchmarks are actually subject to regulation in the European Union. So we do
Yes.
have a regulator at Platts.
No, I understand that.
Yeah, so it was. I just I mentioned that because I actually find that governments are intensely interested, and regulators are intensely interested in what's going on with these physical commodity market benchmarks. But maybe to your point, it doesn't get talked about in the media the same way that regulatory interest in other markets does get talked about. And so I find that, I mean, just looking at the amount of correspondence that I get, they're super interested, but maybe it doesn't get the same kind of headlines. And I think it maybe comes back to the fact that, we talked at the beginning of the show about how, headline prices can be different from physical market prices. And so the physical prices, it's too complicated for people to want to read about in the morning when they wake up. But headline futures prices are more digestible. So, insofar as regulatory interest aligns with public narrative and so on, it'll always be directed towards those headline futures prices. But, in my experience, the regulators are super interested in physical benchmarks, and they just make a little bit less maybe public noise about it when they are.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Dave, talking about being zoomed out, let's just continue on that a little bit because it just occurred to me that let's take a Brent benchmark. It's very much linked to the fixed price, and fixed price is, of course, it's your cash partials which happen in your window, but they are very, very closely linked to the futures market, to the EFP, exchange of physical. So there's a very close link between PRAs and exchanges. Can you say a little bit more about that relationship? Because there is
sure.
kind of, you're kind of frenemies, aren't you? That you compete on certain things. Well, I mean, the exchanges can also, they can have benchmarks. They had 1 minute
Sure.
markers that Saudis use and so on.
Sure.
And but they still, they haven't prevailed, and they probably won't.
Well, I guess, price reporting agencies and exchanges are, of course, like fundamentally different business activity areas, right? And so the partnership is stronger as a tone than the competitive element, I would say. So we work with. I mean, last time I checked, it was about 25 exchanges around the world. We just listed Data Brent futures with the National Stock Exchange in India, trading in rupees. So the partnership is stronger than the competitive element, at least in my personal experience. And I'm not just saying this because I'm on the show with you guys. And the reason why the partnership is pretty strong is because PRAs can do things that exchanges can't do. We can go off and discover physical markets that maybe aren't ready to be traded in a kind of a exchange environment, and we can begin to publish assessments for those markets, right? We can reasonably go out and say, as we did about 15 years ago, we think the spot market value for LNG delivered to Asia is $15 an MMBTU. An exchange just can't do that one day. I don't think there's a mechanism for that, right? So we can discover and cover physical markets. Any PRA can do this, although I like to think we're the best. And then exchanges could choose to list financially settled derivatives against those assessments if they're seen to be robust enough and representative enough, right? So we can do things exchanges can't do, and it goes without saying exchanges can do things that we can't do, right? So the need for us to partner up for the markets to work effectively is always going to be there, I think.
That's great. So you mentioned that you would like to set a couple of benchmarks before you finish. Is it too much to ask what you're thinking of, or?
I'm still in my discovery process. I would love to get a water one going before I'm done. And there are at least a half a dozen meaningful ways to get into water. But I do think that water is the one big commodity market which is fundamentally mispriced into humanity right now. And if we don't solve that problem, we're going to have much bigger issues in 10 or 15 years from now, maybe less, frankly. If you look at the way the water market works in the UK, it's a debacle. I mean, it rains all year long and we have shortages in the summertime. How is that even possible? And then the water quality is terrible. So I think that market mechanisms would help shape up the water market, not just for our first world problems here in the UK, but for the benefit of water balances in the global market, which is much more of an acute issue, by the way, in other parts of the world. So water is one I'd like to figure out. And there are a couple of other ones out there, but sizing, need, appetite, these are things I need to explore. So I'll leave you with water, but I want to get to at least two more beyond that. I like to think I have maybe a little bit of time left.
Let me just throw you one extra idea for your consideration. I watched something really good on BBC Two yesterday about rubbish. That's another problem.
Oh, that's interesting. Rubbish. Yeah. It's interesting, Audie, because one thing that I haven't been able to crack is how does anybody price a waste material? That's like a fundamental question, right? Why haven't the carbon markets taken off outside of compliance spaces? It's because carbon at the end of the day is seen as being a waste product. Nobody will buy it because you can't really use it for anything. Not really, although people have tried, right? So waste products is interesting. How do you price a waste product? Maybe that is the other one,
I use
it's back to what Enron got wrong, isn't it? Really, in their day, and you referred to Enron. When you were in Houston, it's all about need.
Yeah, it's all about need. Yep.
And Enron forgot that or didn't pay attention to it, and they floated all these markets that they wanted to trade and build, but there was no need.
There was nothing, Colin, that Enron wouldn't make a two-way market on, whether you needed it or not. And I do think that was part of the demise. You're quite right.
There you go.
Yep.
Yeah, it's true. It's interesting. I use that in class very often as an example of negative pricing.
Yeah.
Negative pricing is actually a lot more common than people think.
Yeah, I mean, that's right.
We are paying for our recycling to be taken away. We are paying for our rubbish to be taken away. These are all negative prices. In the US, currently, gas in many places is highly negative because everyone is trying to pump as much oil associated with that gas as they can, and that's where they're making all their money.
Audie, sounds like me and you and Colin should take this one offline and figure it out. I like it.
No, that calls for a good lunch, and we'll talk about it. Dave, I'm very conscious of your highly valuable time. We basically have done what we set to do roughly. I think there are many more conversations to be had here, and I really hope Colin. I'm sure Colin agrees with me. We'd love to have you here again, and we can make a little bit more topic specific.
That would be great.
Yeah, this conversation did go a little bit more astray from what I was hoping and Colin probably was hoping, because normally we just take it leisurely about chats about the good old days. But situation currently is so topical that we just had to kind of go somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it was great. I think folks listening to the podcast will find your comments extremely interesting.
I hope so.
Thank you very much, Dave. It really is good of you to take the time.
Well, thank you, Colin, and thank you, Audie. And look, I'm always happy to come on and talk about the good old days too, or anything else you'd like to get into. So maybe we can do another episode somewhere down the line. But I really enjoyed being with you guys today, and I really appreciate the questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
All right. See you guys.